It's an impossible, don't worry.
Thofner.
It's an impossible surname. Okay, so would you like me to begin?
I'm going to introduce you. So
sorry, yes, okay, fine. Why don't I set up my screen though so you can see it? Because that's far more interesting than looking at my face.
Great. So good morning again, everybody. Here we are from the drill hall, and for our first talk of the lab, Women and the Woodland, History and Mythology with Margit Thofner. She's coming to us from Norfolk in the UK. I've never actually met her before in person, but she knows my identical twin sister, so she recognizes me in a way. So she's going to speak with us for a while. If you have questions as we go along, write them in the Q&A box, and Ellie and Callum will, if it's pertinent, just kind of drop in with Margit and ask her at the time or ask her at the end. So just you can type in whenever it comes to you. And here, if we've got questions, we can jot them down or put our hand up or shout and come to the mic and say what it was that we wanted to. Great, can we welcome Margit into the room?
Thank you. Thank you, Hayley, first and foremost, for inviting me to this. It's very exciting. It's a bit of a departure for me. I'm a bit of a sort of cut and dried academic in some ways. So having to think about dance, I'm very interested in music. Having to think about dance has been a very interesting challenge. And what I put together for you, it's not really so much of an argument as a set of reflections, which I hope might trigger, some ideas, set off your creativity, make you think about dancing and other projects. And also, and I've been thinking about this quite deliberately, I'll be honest, I hope this is something that can fortify us, give us some strength for the coming months, because we have, I think, quite a complicated year ahead of all of us. And thinking about where strength, women's strength in particular, might come from is perhaps a good thing to be doing in January 2021.
Perfect, thank you.
So the structure, the way I put this together is around the number 3. Of course, these 3 themes can actually be found in all the things that I'm going to discuss. So it's not like they are clear-cut categories. And there are other unifying strands, including things like fertility. It's a very important issue when we put women in woodland, the business of female fertility, and which of course is fertility full stop. But there's also awe, and of course fear, attraction, sexuality. And then there is the nature of specific trees, not just any old woodland, but specific trees. And the reason I decided that this should be structured in terms of the number 3 is actually because of a scene in the novel The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. It's a famous novel about post-war Germany, really post-Second World War Germany, but it has the chief person, Oscar Matera, remembering how he used to be able to play this, he has this tin drum and he drums incessantly on it and drives everybody mad. But he manages to disrupt the Nazi rally, where people, of course, are marching, playing march music, by beginning to drum up a storm on his drum in waltz beat. So waltz beat, or triple meters, or minuet beats, or, there are lots of dances associated with triple meters, of course, as you know more about than I do, is a very distinctly kind of disruptive rhythm. It's a way of looking at the world in an offbeat way. I think the big point Günter Grass was trying to make is that you can't march to a waltz rhythm. So what happens, instead of the Nazi rally taking place and all the men marching, is that the group breaks up and they all start dancing. And it's always seemed to me to be a very powerful scene about the strength of dance to be a creative force for good, but also the strength of different types of rhythm to make people move differently and think differently, therefore, about their bodies, about the world, how we fit into the world. So that's why I've chosen this kind of tripartite structure. And you'll see that in each dance, there are 3. So it's actually a 3 times 3 structure, this one. And that again is quite deliberate. And that's also because I really think thinking about time and the category of time is important in relation to woodland, because woodland sets us into types of time that actually are almost beyond human imagination, particularly when we encounter ancient trees. And being keyed into that type of time that really isn't so much about the here of now, but about the coming generations and the past generations, both of people and of trees, I think is quite an important theme of what I'm trying to say today. So without further ado, let's get started on the first dance of divinity, as I've called it. I'd like to introduce you, some of you may have met her before, to Hathor. Hathor was an ancient Egyptian goddess. In fact, she was the primeval goddess. She was the mother or origin of all the other gods. Normally, she's shown as a woman with the head of a cow, and she's very often depicted in this way, the ears of a cow or simply in cow form. She can be a pure white cow carrying a tray of food above her head, and her udders flow with milk. She was very closely associated in ancient Egypt with the River Nile, the flow of the River Nile, upon which, of course, all life depended, the flooding of the Nile annually to fertilize and water the lands of Egypt, without which there could be no life. But what is, for our purposes, I think, very interesting about Hathor is that she's also the goddess of dancers and musicians. So here what you have is a particular tomb painting, and of course it's a banquet, so it's meant to be what the deceased would have taken with him and her, because it's a couple together, into the afterlife. And one hope was that you would have dancers and musicians and wine. All those amphorae you see there on your right, they are wine. And I think what's a couple of number of really interesting things about this image is that women danced together and men danced together in ancient Egypt. There was not a sexual, you did not dance with somebody of the opposite sex. You were always in a group of women. And very often not wearing anything, as you can see, not least because, of course, it's hot in Egypt and dancing would make you enormously hot, but also because the dance was very much about life. But also in this case, of course, because it's a tomb monument about death, and you'll see that the dancers are clapping their hands, as are some of the people sitting next to the female musician blowing her double flute, and clapping hands and doing these kind of rhythms at a funeral was actually meant to help prayers, but with it came a special dance that involved the clapping of hands. And very often that was done in a couple of women or a group of women together. And that was really because Hathor was so important in terms of funerary rites, because she had the power to help conduct people to the afterlife. So she is an enormously powerful goddess, and it is interesting that she's associated with song and dance, and that's with joy. Also, actually, with pretty unbridled sexuality. She's like the naughtiest, if you like, of the Egyptian female gods. She likes to get about, shall we say, and gets away. That was considered quite appropriate for her in her divine being. And again, for our purposes, I think what's very interesting is that one of the many names of Hathor is Lady of the Sycamore. She was very closely associated with a plant called the Sycamore Fig. And the association hinges, in fact, around the idea of milk. So I told you that she's associated with cows and milk, but also with the River Nile. Now, the Sycamore Fig, you can see the hanging on the tree, gives a white milky sap if you cut it open, which you can eat, and people did eat. So the sycamore tree was strongly associated with her because of this sap, because of this milky sap. But I think you can also see in this particular wall painting, what's very interesting is that she isn't a symbol of the tree or the tree a symbol of her. She is the tree. Her feet are the roots. Her legs is the trunk. Her breasts are so very clearly the figs that give milk. And you'll see she holds, as she's giving food to the two people hoping to get to the afterlife, she's also got a jug, which probably is of milk. You'll also see that the food that she's giving them looks rather phallic. So there is this kind of sense of fertility suffusing this image in quite a powerful way, I think. At the same time, I also think it's really interesting that she's associated with liquid, with milk, with water, with movement that isn't human. And I think this idea of fluidity is part of her very being. And the instability of women as they relate to woodland, that they are not just themselves, they are also the wood. And they can shapeshift in between being tree, being milk, being water, being actually the person who helps the ferryman on the way into death. Hathor has many, many aspects. And that is actually quite an important part of woodland women, if you like, a woodland, mythological woodland women, that they have this fluidity. They're not bounded individuals. And from the point of view of dancing, this business of not being just oneself, or being much more than oneself, I think is quite interesting. It's also worth thinking a bit harder about the actual sycamore tree, which you can see in this example from Ethiopia, is an absolutely magnificent being. You see, if you see the little people down the foreground, the cat, you get a sense of just how enormous this thing is. It's also a very special type of tree because it can grow at some distance from water. So in ancient Egypt, it was found on the edges of the desert where the Nile met the desert. And sometimes you find them where there are underground springs, because you wouldn't know that. So you can imagine that a tree that appears like this out of quite a barren, arid landscape is nothing short of a miracle. It looks like this incredible living thing, a force of nature that you can't actually quite understand, but only be thankful for. A divine gift, if you like. And it's worth pointing out that it's a deciduous tree, which is unusual in semi-arid regions. It loses its leaves during the winter and it looks like it's dead. But then if you go up close, you might be lucky enough to find a fig or two still surviving, because they actually keep going through winter. Then in early spring, when the Nile water comes, buds become green fruit. They emerge very early on in the Egyptian early spring. So it is a life bearer even in the midst of death. That's how it looks to them. It's a very emphatically feminine embodiment of what divine power might look like when channeled through a tree. And I think that sense of something that is inexplicable, something that is beyond what can be grasped, is something that ancient trees like this one in particular brings to us, as well as the sense of time. This particular tree you're looking at was a fig in the ground beginning to grow when none of us were even thought of. Now let's move from single trees on the edge of the forest, on the edge of the desert, sorry, into the forest proper. And here is an important point, of course. In ancient Egypt, you couldn't have woodland goddesses because there weren't any woodlands. There was only these kinds of trees on the edge of the Nile Delta. But in ancient India, of course, there was plentiful rainforest. And hence it's no surprise that in ancient or Vedic Hinduism, you found a very interesting goddess called Aranyani. She is the goddess of the forest and the animals who dwell in the forest. And she has this interesting distinction of having a very long text, comparatively speaking to other things, dedicated to her in the Rig Veda, which is one of the ancient sacred texts of Buddhism. You can see from the slide, I hope, that we're looking at something that really is a very ancient type of devotion indeed. It's called the Aranya Sukhtam, this little hymn, and it tells you quite a lot of interesting things about the goddess of wild and forest. This is a 9th century English translation, which I've chosen because it's quite poetic. There are lots of different ways of translating the Sanskrit in effect, and worth looking up all the different versions. But I like the very fact that it opens with the idea that she's not visible. You do not see her. And she is not near people because she isn't frightened. And you don't actually see her, but you hear her. You hear tinkling bells, which of course is the grasshopper and the cicada. And then there is this idea that there clearly is some sort of people living in her forest. But it isn't tight cultivation, because in the evening, the lady of the forest, you see, seems to free the wains, set cattle free. And then there is a sort of nice rustic scene where one's calling to his cow, another one's followed the tree. But then it says at eve, the dweller in the wood fancies that somebody hath screamed. But there is something uncanny, something strangely powerful about this otherwise extremely benign woodland goddess. And then it says, the goddess never slays unless some murderous enemy approach, which I think is a very interesting way that, again, she's a bountiful goddess, but it doesn't mean that she's a pushover. It does not mean that she will not defend herself, nor that you should respect, you should respect her. And I think I love the closing line, the mother of all sylvan things, who tills not but hath stores of food. So she doesn't work. She's the forest. She does not need to work, but the forest is bountiful. It gives, but on its own terms. And one of those terms, I think, is to accept that the lady of the forest will not be seen, because she is the forest. She's not something you can grasp, not some being that, is like a human. She is actually the whole ecosystem of the forest. And it is particularly striking that in this very ancient text, I'll just take you back again, tinkling bells. The one thing that I think we all know about traditional Indian dances is that bracelets, armlets, anklets with bells is a way of putting a rhythm or emphasizing the rhythm of the dance and actually generating music about a dance which otherwise may not need any music other than the cicadas and the grasshoppers. So I think these lovely bells, I've just brought you a random set of 19th century dancing bells from India, are part of a way of thinking about this particular landscape and this particular rhythm. It's a place where one dances with bells. Now, we can grasp one aspect of Aranyani, if not actually herself, whom we can't see. That's because in Hinduism and also in Buddhism and Jainism, there's a type of nature spirit called Yakshini or Yakshinis, and they're usually associated with sacred sites, especially with sacred groves and therefore sacred trees. In the Hindu tradition, they attend the treasure of the gods and hence the Hindu god of wealth. So there is already a sense of plentifulness. But they can be nasty, Yakshinis. They can actually be like poltergeists and, make life difficult for humans. So they might need some appeasing. So again, we see a kind of double-sidedness, just as in Aranyani and Hathor, where there is power, but there is also the capacity of doing harm and managing that harm, potential harm in various ways, of course, is what the so interesting, I think, about Aranyani, that she withholds it gracefully, but she certainly will have teeth if you attack her. Now, of course, as you can see, there is a very suggestive part to this particular dance, which is that, the Yakshini is virtually naked and she embraces the tree in a fairly straightforward manner, really. And they certainly are symbols of sexuality and fertility as well, these. But to really get a hold of what this particular spirit, because she's not a goddess, a Yakshini, she's a spirit, particularly spirit is about, we actually need to understand what she's very often used for. So here is the great stupa at Sanchi, where you'll see Yakshini help to guard the entrances. And indeed, this Yakshini comes from that stupa, was unfortunately removed in the 19th century by British archaeologists and is now in the British Museum. But you can see, I hope you can see over here, that is the sort of space that Yakshini would be in. And if, like me, you've got the little, I'll move that over. See, can you see here she is over there as well? There is a matching one. So the one you're seeing here is still in situ. And that tells us something really quite important. Some of you will probably know this, but a stupa is a very distinct kind of monument. It's a Buddhist shrine containing part of the ashes of the Buddha. But of course, because the Buddha did not want to be venerated as a god, he wanted people to think about the path to enlightenment. This isn't not about venerating the Buddha as such. It's about retracing the Buddha's path to enlightenment. when you go as a pilgrim to visit the stupa. And to see how that works, we really kind of need to engage a bit more with the structure of it. So here's a wonderful old drawing of the great stupa at Sanchi, one of the most famous Buddhist stupas in the world, in fact. And I hope you can see from the plan up here that what one does is you enter into one of these spaces in this offbeat way. It's not a straight portal that's guarded by the Yakshini. It's this sort of strange offbeat thing. And then you go clockwise round. And as you trace the movement from east to north to west to south, you then retrace the movement, life movement of the Buddha from birth to enlightenment. So this is very much about structuring movement, about thinking about a way of moving through space. And what's very interesting about stupa is that it's never orientated on a north, south, east, west axis, never. It is definitely what we call an axis mundi, meant to set up a sense of the center of the world and the world in a kind of nutshell. But at the same time, it's never straightly orientated to the world. It's always at a kind of slight angle. And I think that is about marking out that this is a sacred site. It doesn't follow the normal rules. But at the same time, as you walk around it, you are tying yourself into the whole Buddhist cosmology as you participate in your pilgrimage. So that's definitely one way of understanding these quite extraordinary sculptures, is that they're gatekeepers. They're powerful gatekeepers, liminal beings that mark the path to enlightenment, but you have to cross into their domain, into the domain of spirits and of the greater world, not just the physical world, to participate in the fertility and the wealth that they stand for. Of course, it's, again, I would say, really worth thinking very hard about not just that it's a tree, but it's a specific type of tree. And indeed, Yakshini are almost invariably associated with a type of tree called an Ashoka, or sorrowless tree, rather beautifully. Originally, this is a rainforest tree. It's somewhat endangered in the wild, but it actually grows very happily in all sorts of cultivated contexts, as you can see here. And I find it particularly lovely the way that it's part of basically everyday life. You can see cooking implements and people drying clothes. So it's very much a tree alongside which people live. And yet it has these beautiful fragrant flowers. And that's one of the reasons it's associated very strongly with the Yakshini, because of the strong sensory presence of a flowering Ashoka tree. So it isn't just about movement here or fertility, it's also about a intense sensuality that's to do with smell and to do with thinking about how smell might lead you to enlightenment in the Buddhist world. So Yakshinis are by and large actually at the tamer end, if you like, of woodland deities, woodland spirits, or wood spirits, tree spirits. But some, in some cultural traditions, are not as benevolent as all, and perhaps at all. And on the best known of that is the lady that I know Haley is particularly interested in the Roman pantheon and the ancient Greek pantheon, known as Artemis in Greek or Diana in Latin. Now, Diana is a particularly interesting figure because she is goddess of woodland, but also of the hunt. And therefore she is particularly aggressive in the sense that she is a killer. She kills and she oversees the killing of animals. So she is perhaps an even more intense version of someone like Hathor, who had a role to play in the passing to the afterlife, where she is an actual killer. And I think that's very interesting. So what you see here is a Roman copy after a lost sculpture, in ancient Greek sculpture. And what I think is really fascinating about this sculpture is the way that her chiton is fluttering. She is right in the middle of quite a powerful forward movement. And although the stag is clearly what she's meant to be hunting, it is also as if she's moving like the stag. And you can see that her leg is actually growing out of a tree. Now, the standard argument when I was a young art historian for this was, oh, that's so that you can support the marble, otherwise it will break. And that's sort of true. But there are lots of ways of supporting marble. It doesn't have to be in the form of a tree. So what we have here, in fact, is Diana also growing out of a tree and being just like Hathor, that powerful thing with feet for roots, legs for a trunk, arms for branches, flowing hair for leaves, flowing chiton for leaves. And you will also see that the power of the goddess is very much underscored by her backwards gesture with her hand to take a quiver out, an arrow out of her quiver. And yet she doesn't have a bow. So what is she going to do with this arrow? Is she going to plunge it into the stag? Is she going to throw it at us? It's a very tense kind of sculpture, and it sets up something of the kind of quite malevolent power of Diana in this particular sculpture. And she isn't just a killer of animals. There is a very famous legend, and it goes all the way back to, oh, that, I beg your pardon, that should say early mid-5th century BC. That is not AD, that's BC on the slide. That is my fault, I beg your pardon. That is much, it's 1,000 years earlier than that says. She is a killer of people as well. So the famous story, which I'm sure several of you are familiar with, is that there was a hunter, Actaeon, who by mistake, but partly by engaging with a mistake he'd made, spied on Diana and her followers, her nymphs, as they bathed naked in a woodland stream. And this Diana would not tolerate. So first she turned Actaeon into a stag, shot at him, and let his own hunting dogs devour him. And that is what you can see here. And I think one of the things that is worth pointing out is, although this is much, much earlier than this sculpture, do you see this sinuous movement of the backward movement here of her drawing the bow, and this gracefully lifted foot so as to balance the way her body twists around, one part of it going this way and the other part going that way. So it's a very dance-like movement, even though it's also a death-dealing movement. And indeed, this kind of painting is famous for this kind of attitude to what we can only really call choreographic stances. This image becomes particularly intense if you take the crater and turn it around in your hand and look at what's the backside. On the back, we see the woodland god Pan, far more conventionally associated with woodland in ancient Greece, in a very aroused state, as you can see, pursuing a poor goat herd who does not really wish to be the object of his attentions. So interestingly, what you have on this side of the vase is a kind of unbridled sexuality, which is certainly supported by the herm at the back. These were conventional waymarkers in ancient Greece. But pursuing the goat herd in this kind of unbridled way, which stands in very strong contrast with the very control movement of Diana. And you will see the exceedingly flaccid Actaeon as he collapses. You know, he is very literally unmanned by the presence of this powerful woman. And it should be pointed out, I think, that the myth of Diana and Actaeon has a very, very long history in Europe. It's something that really fits within the European imaginary context. So I show you here, you know, a painting that is a good 2,000 years later than the Greek vase painting that I showed you, but still is focused around the idea of Diana and Actaeon and this kind of balletic movement. Here we have Actaeon spying, you know, coming across Diana and her nymphs, and here is the goddess looking exceedingly cross because she's been interrupted in her bath. So there is a very powerful erotic charge in this particular image, and you are certainly meant to think, oh, what beautiful naked women. In 16th century terms, these are exceedingly beautiful women. But there is a companion painting where the balletic movement has been swapped. Here it is Actaeon, who's kind of standing up and on the back foot. But here we see that repeated graceful movement off Diana, as she is now, shooting poor Actaeon, who's over here, and who is in the process of being devoured by his own dogs. So I think Diana stroke Artemis is perhaps one of the most interesting examples of the potentially malevolent force that a woodland deity, a female woodland deity, can be. And in Europe, there's a lot of this, in fact, which I could go on and on about if we just want to talk about Europe. But I think it's quite helpful not to just assume that woodland deities and spirits and woodland mythologies that link women to woodland are all the same. They're not. As you saw in India, the goddess is powerful, but she does not kill. So she's quite different from Diana in that sense, even if they share quite a lot of features. And of course, that then takes us on to the very idea of, because a lot of the spirits, the goddesses, the types of being that is associated with woodland across the world where woodland is found is about a kind of power, a kind of strength that's actually quite difficult to conceptualize. So let's move to another place where woodland at least was, sadly not so much anymore, but was conventionally very plentiful, which is Yoruba Land in present-day Nigeria. And first, I'd like to look at the Orisha, Aya. Orisha is conventionally translated as goddess, but it's not a particularly precise translation. The belief system that the Yoruba traditionally subscribe to has one chief god, one central god called Olodumare, which is a kind of spirit. It's a world being, and it is a benevolent being, but it's kind of distant. It's the way the Yoruba conceptualize it, is that it's like a father who does not wish to be dependent upon his children. That is the last thing a father would wish to be. He wants to watch, and it is a he wants to watch from a distance to let the children get on with their lives. But to help them, he has Orishas, and the Orishas are aspects of the divine. They are not, in a sense, individuals. They're not gods. They are aspects of the divine. And Aya is a particularly interesting aspect, I think, because she is another goddess of the forest, or the Orisha of the forest, of the animals within it, and specifically of herbal healing. So Aya will carry people off into the forest to teach them the secrets of healing. All the medicinal properties of plants, as traditionally passed down in Yoruba society. And of course, if you live or you have your cultural origins in a rainforest, you have lots of interesting plants at your disposition. And Aya is the teacher of that knowledge. So she brings healing. She's in some ways quite the opposite of Diana. She's also like the Indian woodland goddess, Aranya, that you can't see her. But there is a way that we can begin to conceptualize her, which is that wood was, of course, absolutely essential to Yoruba art in all its forms. And the carving of wood was used for anything you can imagine, all the way down from everyday utensils, all the way up to royal scepters. This is a particularly intriguing royal scepter because it has on it, as you can see, a nursing mother. So woodland and fertility are tied into each other simply by the making of this scepter. This is not Aya. It is, however, one aspect of the divine. And what's really interesting about Aya is that she's tiny. She's about 1 to 2 feet high. You know, just larger than the figure on the scepter, but quite small. And that's one of the reasons why you can't see her. You can only feel her as you go into the forest, as you study the medicinal properties of herbs, as you engage with the healing that the woodland can bring. She's there, but you can't know that she's there. But you can trust her power because she is a healer. Now, these kind of distinct woodland spirits are very much part of Yoruba culture. And there is also riverine spirits. So we are now this is the river Osun. And this is actually not just a river. This river is also a an Orishi, a Yoruba goddess. And around this river is a very important sacred grove, which has probably been a sacred grove for about 700 years. And there is a story attached to how this grove came about, which is that there was a bunch of people wandering around. There was famine, and they were wandering, trying to find a place to settle, a bunch of Yoruba people led by Olutimehin. And they settled, but the goddess then materialized in front of them and said, "You can't settle here. This is my sacred forest." So she said to them, "You got to move downstream," which is actually where the present day, or the city of Osogbo still is, in the Osun state of Nigeria. "And I need my sacred grove left to myself." And so a bargain was struck that if they would move downriver to the city and she could keep the sacred grove, and they would make sacrifices to her in that sacred grove, then everybody could live peacefully and in fertility. That is to say, the famine would go. She would give them, the river goddess and the goddess of the grove would give them enough to eat. So here is another powerful, bountiful woodland and river goddess who gives nourishment to starving people. And I think it's really worth pointing out that this site went into some decline in the mid-20th century and now has been brought back with the help of a lot of very interesting works of modern art to become yet again a sacred shrine of the Yoruba. And here you see the high priestess. The rites that happen in this woodland shrine is very much run by women. Not all the rites are, but quite a lot of them are. That connection, therefore, is actually very much a living tradition. That is not the case for all the things I've shown you today, but this is very much a living tradition, and quite deliberately so, a deliberately tradition, because people were very worried about losing it. So that is one side of feminine strength or power, if you like, is the beautiful, the giving, the healing. But there is another side, which again, if we return to Europe, although witchcraft certainly also exists in the Yoruba context and all sorts of other places, there is, of course, the witch. And in Europe, witches are very closely associated with trees. So you just need to consider this engraving from the early 16th century, where you can see three quite frightening creatures, one of them with lion's claws. And they've actually trapped this devil. So the suggestion is that these are so powerful, these women, that they can even trap the fiend himself. Yeah. And he's saying, "Let me go, let me go." But that's not what they're doing. They give him a right old beating. And you will see over here is the city. But these women are not of the city. They are of the woodland, although it's a very frightening and strange woodland. So here is that malevolent horror again. And I think it's also worth thinking of how the tresses of this woman's locks are like the leaves again. So hair and leaves often get rhymed together across all the traditions we've been looking at. And similarly, in Italy, we have a very long tradition. So the print you just saw was German, but this is in the town of Benevento, that there was just south of Milan, there was a particular walnut tree, which was gone by the 16th century, but on which all the witches of Italy would meet. And what is really interesting at this site is that we know there was a cult, an ancient Roman cult here, of none less than Diana, goddess of the hunt. So there is actually some potential continuity here between Christian and post-Christian religions. And there's something you have to be very careful. You can't assume that all witchcraft traditions in Europe were linked up in this way. But at Benevento, at least, we seem to have this kind of link. I think it's also really interesting that it's the walnut tree. So again, a very specific type of tree. Walnut trees are very interesting. On one level, they're associated in Europe traditionally with misfortune, because the leaves and indeed the outer shells of the nut contains quite a powerful herbicide. So usually beneath walnut trees has very little growing in it, because the walnut in effect kills everything that grows. On the other hand, the walnut tree in ancient European mythology of the south was associated with the god Jupiter and with fertility again. You'll see the theme of fertility coming up. You could even jokingly call them Jupiter's nuts if you wish. At the same time, as we all know, you open up a walnut and the half of the nut looks like a human brain. And therefore, from the late antiquity right into the early modern period, into the 19th century, in fact, Europeans believed that eating walnuts would be good for your brain, as well as good for fertility. The walnut tree in itself has that complicated double-sided power. It's a killer, but it's also a feeder. And I hope you noticed in the very old drawing by de la Porta from the early 16th century that the witches are, of course, dancing. They aren't just meeting under the tree, they're dancing under the tree. So dancing underneath a walnut tree would be a very interesting way of thinking about both positive and negative sides of feminine creativity. Oh, that should say dance of power as well. Sorry, I beg your pardon, that was typed too fast. Now, the third dance of power is very much structured by the number 3. The most powerful goddesses, without doubt, in ancient Norse mythology, so the beliefs of the Vikings and ancient Anglo-Saxons, were the Nornia, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, who were the 3 goddesses of fate. They live at the foot of an ash tree, Yggdrasil, which is the world tree, the center of the entire Viking world. And there they spin and weave with great patience all the destinies of human beings. So each of us have a thread, but some of those threads are woven together by these 3 sisters, and one of them spins, and you can see one of them weaves, and one of them cuts. And the cutter is the one who is the most powerful of all, because she tells us when we die. So these goddesses in ancient Viking belief were simply invincible. They held the whole world, all of humanity and the gods in their hands because they were weavers. And I think that kind of quiet strength of the weaving thread and weaving threads together is a really interesting way of thinking about this particular triplet of sisters. And also the idea of women working together. Some of the goddesses we have looked at, like Diana, are frightfully individualistic, but here this is actually about female collaboration, dancing together around the thread, as we saw the Egyptian dancers dance together. And again, it's worth thinking about, well, what sort of tree is it that they're sitting under? It's an ash. Now, ash trees to the Vikings were absolutely sacred. They have a whole number of properties. Ashes can be used within 10 years. A 20-year-old ash you can carve an orb from. They grow quite fast. When you cut down an ash, you can burn the wood straight away. It does not need to season. It will take flame straight away because it's actually quite dry wood. It is pliable, it is strong. And if you coppice an ash, it will grow back again and again and again. So by coppicing, if you don't know what that is, you basically cut it down to within like an inch of its trunk. And next spring, it will shoot again, as if by magic. And it will keep doing that. If you go to a place, as we are here in Norfolk, some of us at least, like Foxley Wood and Norfolk, you can see 700-year-old coppice stools like the one I'm showing you here, which is just an ash tree that has been cut down and grown back and cut down and grown back. So you can see why for the Vikings, the ash was an absolutely essential part of existence. It's what you make oars of. It's what you make bean poles of, so you can grow beans. It is also what one of the first human beings were made of. So one of the things that's very interesting about Viking mythology, and it makes sense because these are woodworkers, these are people who live on ships made of wood, so wood is essential to their lives. But the first 2 humans in Viking mythology were made of oak and ash, or sometimes elm and ash, but the ash tree is always there. And I think what's really interesting is we know that one was the man and one was the woman, but we don't know who. And I think you can think for yourself either which way around. Are you an ash? Are you an elm? Are you an oak? Those are all three possibilities in the Viking narrative of creation. When the three gods, creator gods, created humans, they created them from trees on a beach. So I think thinking about the ash tree and the relationship to that particular mythological context helps us to think about a very different type of strength, which is actually pliability. It's the fact that ashes are bendy and flexible is what gives them their particular strength. And you can put a weight on a bit of ash that you can't on other types of wood, even when it's dried out. So there is a very particular type of strength. And that, of course, then moves us on to my third and final theme, you'll be pleased to know, of the day, my last three dances. The first one is indeed a dance of strength, of quite a formidable kind. So the word Pachamama is attached to, again, something that's more like a concept than really a divinity. In this case, in the ancient Andean mountains. We are now in South America. And when you see Pachamama, she is often in this kind of aspect. There are not that many sculptures of her because she is in fact a creature of everything rather than a specific being. But here is a particularly impressive and very ancient monument in her honor. Now, she is both the mother of the earth and of time. She is fertility. She presides over planting and harvesting. She embodies the mountains. That is to say, she is the mountains. And you might say, hang on, where's the woodland gone? But what's very interesting about Pachamama is that she is also worshipped by ancient trees. So I show you here a trunk of ancient mahogany from Honduras, sadly now very endangered, but they are incredible things, as well as a diagram of what Pachamama actually is. So this is a diagram put together by somebody who was half Spanish, half Inca priest in the early 17th century, trying to explain on the basis of a very now lost wall painting in a temple, how exactly Inca cosmology works. And the thing is this, here are the four, the sun, the moon, the woods and water are all contained within this one great thing here, which is the mountain. So Pachamama is everything because she is the mountain. And the Inca, of course, famously believed that they descended from the mountains. So they're quite different from the Viking, who thought they descended from trees. The Inca think they descend from the mountains, but what they share is the sense of a powerful female goddess, or a set of goddesses in the Viking case, associated intimately, not just with human fates, but with the fate of absolutely everything. Pachamama just is. She is being. But she is also the mountains. She is the rock upon which we build. Now, my second dance of strength is a very strange and not very developed myth, which comes from the Gilbert Islands in the Pacific. So they're not very far, sort of in between Papua New Guinea and Australia. So part of the Polynesian or Melanesian, really Micronesian environment. Now, Ne Titu Abini is the goddess of trees in the Gilbert Islands. And there is a legend associated with her, which is there was a great chief called Aranya, of a giant stature and with skin very reddish of hue. And that's an interesting thing in this part of the world. Deities are often kind of reddish in their skin, whereas of course normal people's skin was kind of brown. But according to legend, this giant falls in love with a beautiful maiden called Ne Titu Abini, and she was particularly known for her beautiful eyes. But sadly, although they tried to have offspring, nothing happened, and Ne Titu Abini died. But here comes the interesting bit. From her grave sprouted 3 trees. From her head, the coconut palm, from her navel, the almond, and from her heels, the pandanus or screw pine. And in this way, Neiti to Albany lives forever because she's alive in these 3 trees. And it is worth pointing out that these 3 trees, and you'll notice how this number 3 is, it's not everywhere, but it does come up a lot in some of these legends, are of actual essential qualities and properties to the people of the Gilbert Islands. So the coconut is, of course, both food and drink, and weaving material. The almond speaks for itself, and the screw pine actually supplies both fruit, but most importantly, weaving material. So here is another type of strength, which is the strength of weaving. Repeat it yet again. Weaving material for making baskets, for making sails for ships. This is very much another sailing community, and it's interesting that, like the Vikings, trees are really important in these sailing communities. So I think here we have a very particular kind of strength, which is that of living forever. And of course, you could even argue that it's a very particular female strength because these are her offspring. She did not have children as such, but she had tree children, and the tree children keep having offspring. And so she projects forward into time for as long as coconut palms, almond trees, and pandanus trees will grow. Oh, sorry, I'm going backwards, beg your pardon. Here is a real human being. I thought when I got towards thinking about the end of this, that having looked at goddesses, tree spirits, all sorts of things, Orishas like that, it would be quite nice actually to think about how such things, how all these strengths, how all these powers might be concentrated in a real human being. And so I chose for one inspiring example of this, the now late Wangari Maathai. She was also known affectionately in her native Kenya as Mother of the Trees. She was leader of what was known as the Green Front Revolution, where she was actually, I should say, a very highly educated woman. She was a veterinary anatomist. She was one of the first women in West Africa to get a PhD. But she was really interested in preventing soil erosion and with it female poverty in her native Kenya. And so she spearheaded this incredible initiative to plant trees. And when I give you this quotation from her, the little things we can do. When she says little things, she actually, the movement she started has presided so far over the planting of 30 million trees, which I just think is incredible and tells you something about what one determined woman can do when she puts her mind to it. And believe me, she is worth looking up. She was one hell of a determined woman. She also won the Nobel Peace Prize, first African woman to do so. Here is another of the interesting things she has to say. Although she's Kikuyu, she was raised as a Christian, her family's a Christian, and indeed went to a school run by Roman Catholic nuns. She did not identify herself as Christian in adulthood, although she was certainly skeptical about Christian attitudes to the environment because she felt there was far too much about lordship and not much about collaboration. But she had a sense, nevertheless, of what you might think of as your own inner part of the divine, which is caring, which is wanting to solve problems, which is wanting to do stuff. And she very interestingly said, and not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of everyone. And that's the important strength, I think, that she brings to us today, is that incredible sense of you do something, you see a problem, you do something about it, but you don't do it just for yourself. So when I was talking about fluidity and reaching out to other human beings earlier in this talk, I think that she, for me, is one of the embodiments of this fluidity. And in particular, because she worked so hard with her sisters, her fellow women, to bring about this incredible tree planting feat, because it was her who helped, and her female friends. It was women who did this. It was a female movement, of course, supported by men who would not want to support people like this. But at the core of it, there were women and they were working together. And you'll see here, they're also dancing together. And that was part of their way of being together. And the quotation I put up for you, I think, is particularly powerful because she thinks of all species together. And I think when you think about woodland, one of the powerful things about woodland is that it is the home of many, many different species living together, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony. It's not necessarily a particularly pretty picture that you get from woodland, but there is that sense of an overarching symbiosis of several types of species, several types of organism working together. And you will also see that she thinks not just of the present, but of the future. And I do think, without sounding too essentialist about it, that if you are a woman, there is a sense in which you think about the responsibility of the future because of your capacity to bear children. There is a weight attached to that capacity. And of course, it is also a male capacity. I'm not, saying that we do it all ourselves, but it is because the child is born of the mother's body. There is a strong sense of what does one do with that responsibility to the future. So that was kind of the ideas and thoughts that I wanted to share with you today. I think for me, the most powerful aspect is this business of time, that when we are in woodland and when we think about woodland and when we think about woodland spirits. Oh, yes, sorry, yes. I know about time. I can't hear you, Hayley. Okay, I'll keep going. I'm nearly finished, yeah, thank you. When we think about this category of time, we should not think about time in our kind of modern way. Time in woodland is a very different thing. And it is both about reaching into the past and learning from the past, but it is also very much about thinking about the future. And now I'm done. So if anyone has... Yes, I can now, yes. No, I can't.
And again, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was just perfect for the whole thing, and really built such a beautiful felt sense as well as picture of women in so many aspects. So thank you for such a beautiful, powerful offering to us. I'm really grateful, and I think probably everybody. What really struck, I think, so if you have questions, there's not too many yet, but I think there's probably some in the room. Begin to type them in the Q&A, and Callum and Ellie, who are the heroes behind the cameras, will can feed them to Margit, and we'll collect them a little bit. But just to say, really, what there were so many things that sung out, but what sung out was the killer thing for me, partly. I'm just taking away this little notification, one sec. But also that the killer sometimes, or the power, it was more power sometimes turned up as killer and sometimes turned up as fig, and they were just kind of equally, well, what I heard was they were kind of, that was equal in a representation of power. It was either fig or it was killer, and that was really something very pertinent about that. And eternalness kept coming up in relation to womanhood, but also this other layer between real woman and eternalness, which is trees, that are, of course, are older than us and more ancient than us, and but not eternal yet, kind of have a time that we don't even understand, but maybe it's a stepping stone. It feels like that to me. As you kept talking about them, I thought maybe that's a stepping stone between woman and eternal, which are all linked in one line, and this line keeps turning up about throughness and then into the future and responsibility. It was just wonderful, and I think we've got some questions coming in, so
I have lots of lovely comments I can see, which is really kind of you all. Thank you very much, because it's a new departure for me to do this kind of thing. So I was trying very hard not to be too academic, but at the same time, it's quite